Thank you. Maybe I should use that microphone. I'm used to walking around.
Okay.
So, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Christophe, for the arduous task of organizing this ContinuuCon, and thanks Sally for doing everything in the first place in Asheville. And thank you to IRCAM for the honor of sponsoring and being host to us. I wanted to do a introduction to the Continuum. Some of you who've played Continuum for a long time know most of these things, but it won't be totally boring because Ed will play some sound examples. And yes. So first I wanted to show you the world headquarters of Haken Audio. This is, I've been started over 35 years ago working on the Continuum, and I've, my international, it's not a corporation, I'm not incorporated, but my international headquarters are here in the boardroom and storage room, as Ed called it, is here. So yes, so I am from Champaign, Illinois, which is about 2 or 3 hours south of Chicago. And Ed Egan is from Ottawa in Ontario, and Christophe is from Versailles, from right here. So there we go. Oh, this picture was taken by Rob Schwimmer, who was visiting me. He's a New York musician who, unfortunately, like many musicians, is scheduled out long in advance. So he was unfortunately not able to come and play, and he's not happy, but had other engagements. All right. So what about the Continuum fingerboard? It builds on aspects of 3 instruments from the 1920s and 30s, the theremin, the martineau, and the tritonium. And it also, in a maybe less obvious way, shares with matrix analog synths. The matrix part of it is obvious. The other parts of analog synths is not quite so obvious since it doesn't have lots of knobs, but there's actually a lot of underlying things that are very similar. The design of the instrument is electromechanical, so it's very different from your iPad app. At the top there is nylon on neoprene. This has changed many, many times throughout the years. The current surface looks like this. The neoprene is made and it rises in a very large pan. It rises, and as it rises, while it's being heated and manufactured, the workers there in China will put down the nylon that's pre-printed, and it fuses to become one thing. That's then a pattern that's a bit shorter than the Continuum, and then it's stretched out. It turns out that stretched out feeling is new to some Continuum owners. Rob, for instance, is a fan of the older way of doing things, but it does make the instrument faster to respond because neoprene itself has memory, and well, this has very short memory if it's stretched. So underneath this neoprene, this is 6.5 millimeter thick, are a bunch of these machined rods. There are hundreds of them in the Continuum there. This is a rod which is hard for you to see, but it's just aluminum. It's round. They're rather large in width, and they're all along the length of the instrument. In the ends of each rod, there's a magnet crimped in there, and then there's also holes drilled in the side. After over a decade of having these made, I learned that really on a microscopic level, those holes have to be accurate. So they're made by, I found a company that also makes Swiss watch parts. Well, anyway, they machine the holes very well, and so the rods are good. Those are then suspended on springs, which are hard to see. There are little piano wire springs in here. Your Continuum contains hundreds of springs. If please, the worst thing you can do is bring it to somebody who's used to repairing keyboards. Because anybody who's used to repairing keyboards will not bother reading instructions. I'm a guy too, I know that. But they'll unscrew the top first to look at what's inside, and well, that's the beginning of a very long process. Now, it's especially confusing because Continuums that were built more recently have an inside piece that prevents all the springs from coming out of position. But there's many Continuums out there that are over 10 years old, and you just be very careful. I'll send you instructions. I'm happy to let you do whatever you want with it. Just yes, it reminds me on my older vehicle, I had a 1950s International Harvester, pickup truck, and I took apart the, when I took that apart, especially the transmission, I was very sad to find out that I shouldn't have done that. So it's an electromechanical design. Underneath all of this stuff are Hall effect sensors, and they actually pick up just the displacement of each rod very accurately. Hall effect is often used in very cheap equipment because as switches they're common, but linear Hall effect sensors, they're a bit expensive, but they're I get about 15 bits out of over 3 millimeters in distance, and that's very good. It's very hard to find any other technology that'll give you that kind of accuracy. Okay, and right, and those Hall effect sensors then put out analog voltages. They're multiplexed, essentially several A to D converters, and those are then serially sent into a Shark DSP, which tracks, figures out the Hall effect stuff, tracks fingers, and computes the eigenmatrix. Okay, so that's what's in there. On the surface, you'll see this pattern of lines. It's like the black keys on a piano. It's just a reference. It's much like having a meter stick. I had a purist who actually did that. They wanted a plain red surface, and they put centimeter scale. That's okay. If you really aren't going to play anything equal tempered. But most people that I've run into that play in other scales know that they don't have to play there, but it's nice to have the reference. The continuum is difficult. Most people that play continuum look at their fingers while they play, which is, I'm a violinist, it's a very beginner thing to do, but it seems to be necessary, at least so far, for continuum. Okay. What is the purpose of expressive controllers? I've been at this for 35 years. I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years this expressive controller idea explode, and at least some of the companies are very, very well funded. And it really depends what you want to do with expressive controllers. In my mind, there's two very different things. First of all, the name expressive controller I think is somewhat silly. I mean, a controller isn't expressive. It's like having a powerful bicycle. It's the rider that's, I mean, it seems a bit odd, but in any case, I'll go with the names. It makes more sense. So the idea of an expressive controller, and a very reasonable way to use an expressive controller is as a new way to interface with all the equipment or synthesizers, software libraries, sample libraries, everything else that you already have. And that's a reasonable, it's really in a way, it amounts to a new way to pitch bend. And I would say that's the vast majority of what you're actually seeing with expressive controllers is a new way to pitch bend, and it matters. You get a more interesting vibrato. It's a very different experience using a pitch wheel than wiggling your finger. So it's basically something that works well with what you have. This is commercially, of course, very important. Very few people want to buy something new that works with nothing that they already have. Then there's this thing that we're trying to do, an acoustic-like experience. By acoustic-like, stick with me for a while. It's a little bit difficult term because our idea isn't to replace acoustic instruments, more that, I always tell people this, I have a gardener who lives next door. She spends a lot of time preparing the earth. She spends a lot of time dealing with slugs, doing all these things. And in the end, some of the plants don't do so well, some do very well, but she likes that. And if I went and gave her a bunch of very nice plastic flowers, they would look good all year. She'd just have to vacuum them once a year. And everything would be easier. And from the street, it would actually be hard to tell, well, except in the middle of winter, it would be hard to tell, because they have little dried up leaves and insects and everything else right on them. The best plastic flowers are amazing. But that's not the experience she wants. And so this idea of if you really interact with the sound, that's a very different thing, and that's something that just isn't supported by existing synthesizers. Why? Because the keyboard has been very successful, and almost all live performance is keyboard oriented, where a keyboard could have polyphonic aftertouch, but it's rare, and it's even rarer that people use it well. And even the polyphonic aftertouch has a very slow rate, so we'll talk about that a little later. But so this requires specialized skills for each preset. It also has this other thing that people are very unused to. If I were anybody who knows me has heard these stories, but I'm old, so I get to say the same thing over and over. But if I were, say, a very good flutist, a world-class flutist, and I decided, okay, in 2 weeks I want to play a trumpet concerto with orchestra, I want to play solo with orchestra, people would just laugh. And in fact, if I spent the rest of my life practicing trumpet, I may never get to be a world-class trumpet player. Even my flute playing is excellent. And if I ever do get to be a world-class trumpet player, I've ruined my lips, I can't play flute anymore. So the whole thing has so much more buy-in. It's a very, very different experience. And is that all positive? No, of course not. An engineer's job is partially to make things easy, but there's this point where making things easy also becomes a de-skilling thing. And de-skilling musicians and making it easy to replace your orchestra with a sample library is not interest for me. So the acoustic-like, here I mean something different. I would say the acoustic-like thing about, say, a theremin is that you are in a feedback loop. And that pitch will not be accurate no matter what you do, and no matter how fancy your theremin is. That pitch will not be accurate unless you, in real time, control it properly. And when your hands start sweating or whatever else happens, you make up for all those effects. And that's part of that experience where you're part of a tight feedback loop for pitch, for timbre, for those sorts of things. One thing that's odd about the continuum, too, even worse than that, you can use existing sample libraries with it. You're just not getting much out of the continuum doing that. I've actually heard some examples that were quite impressive. But I think the main reason to buy a continuum is you like the lifetime learning curve. So, for instance, Ed makes these presets. He'll tell you about those. And some of them have different ways of playing. It takes quite a while to learn it. You don't just press the flute button or the trumpet button on your general MIDI synth. All right. If you have any questions, or if I'm talking too fast, please let me know. I drank less coffee today, so hopefully I won't talk too fast. I have 5 things that are very important about the continuum and are generally missing from other expressive controllers. Does this mean they're useless? No, not at all. In fact, a MIDI keyboard, the freedom you get by not having to control every detail of the sound is enormous and is one of the strengths of a MIDI keyboard. So I'm not at all saying that the MIDI keyboard is a bad thing. It's just there's also another world out there. And so to complement that as opposed to replace it, I want to talk about the continuum. So low latency is essential for immediacy. And the fingerboard scans, there's hundreds of sensors in there, but it does the scanning and all the tracking and all the other good stuff it has to do about 3 times a millisecond, about 350 microseconds. Why don't you just play some things? I've talked long enough. So it's hard to tell when you're listening that it has fast response, because if there were a constant delay there, it'd be very playable. But the fast response, the people that, one of the reasons these are percussion examples is percussionists always notice. They have an incredible sense for very, very fast response. And yes, so, and a lot of people that play older versions of Continuum and it was slower think it's fine and looked at me funny when I came up with a new one and actually didn't know they were missing anything until they tried a newer one. So it's a little bit hard to tell, but over time you can tell. There are many things associated with going quickly, and we can talk about that on some other occasion. There is one thing I wanted to mention. For a not keyboard instrument, it's sort of common knowledge that if you are playing a continuous surface, you can't play very fast because you can't place your fingers accurately, quickly enough. The violin solves that problem by having parallel strings, so you don't have to move your hand very far. You still have to move fingers, half steps usually, but you don't shift positions very often usually. And so many string instruments do that. They have parallel strings, so you can quickly hit new notes, and so you have a nice reference. Here, from Oscar Sala from 1933, where he's the best at using the technique anyway. This is from a Trautonium. This is a major scale. You can see the finger spacing. The idea here is Oscar Sala got to be just fantastic at doing octave shifting. They had a subharmonic oscillator on their Trautonium, and in actual fact, when I listen to Trautonium, its main use, at least for Oscar Sala, seems to be in many, at least in faster pieces, hey, use it as an octave shifter. So he has a pedal that can shift down and up an octave, and stay in place. Parks his finger in position very accurately. It doesn't have to be equal tempered or anything for one octave, and leaves them there. Doesn't move his hands at all. There's only vertical movement of the fingers. Now in Trautonium, it's extremely difficult. I say, oh, it's this trick and it's so easy. No, this is a picture of 1933 in Trautonium manual, and I doubt that anybody else besides Oscar Sala really got good at it. But if you were to practice enough, as Rob Schwimmer is actually trying to do, you should be able to play extremely fast. In fact, even very favorably comparable to piano, because you aren't moving your hands at all. It's not just that you have to, on the piano you have to hit the right lever. Here, you don't move your fingers at all. You only move them vertically, and then you have a pedal. It's very, very hard to press that pedal at the right time and do the octave switching in a very fast run. I saw, when I first learned of this, there were actually pieces from, unfortunately, this was also the Nazi era, so I knew of these pieces, and I knew they were faked. And it was only a few years ago that it occurred to me, no, maybe they really weren't faked. So I just figured it was Nazis trying to show off. But it turns out that it takes incredible skill to the point where if you look at videos, they're unfortunately all in German, but if you look at Oscar Sala videos from the 80s and 90s, he's demonstrating the technique and he screws it up. He can't really do it. I also suspect the recordings we have from 1930, they'd done like 60 performances. I suspect they recorded them all, and what you're hearing is the good performance. But in any case, it is an interesting technique. I went out of my way. We, of course, can use switch pedals to switch octaves. There's also this tri-octave pedal, which some continuum players have been experimenting with that are interested in these techniques. So in this case, it's kind of funny. People that do this also tend to have a full-size continuum, but for the very fast passages, they're just staying in one octave. Okay, pressure sensitivity. How am I doing on time here? Okay, in pressure sensitivity, good pressure sensitivity is very important for this idea of a tight feedback loop. Those of you who play theremin, or at least are familiar with theremin, know that a theremin player is always listening. And if you had a theremin without sound, good luck playing anything. If only the audience could hear you, you wouldn't get anywhere. If you had a theremin where you put in a 40 millisecond delay between you playing, you might be able to do something, but it'd be really hard. So the fact that there's an immediate fast feedback loop is very important. And in the theremin, obviously it's sort of in your face because it's for pitch, but that sort of feedback loop exists in acoustic instruments. I'm not a very good violin and viola player, but I grew up with those instruments. And certainly when you play a vibrato on a violin, you have the more bony part, the flabbier part of your finger touching the string. You get timbre changes from that alone. And so this idea of a synth vibrato where just the pitch changes is quite artificial sounding. If you can have details what the fingers are doing, even beyond what a person is consciously controlling. There's interesting things that happen, and there's all of these things that aren't random but are also not really controlled, where people are either consciously or unconsciously, the best performers can control them. There's a very important thing in pressure in transient parts of the sound, especially in the attack of a sound. Of course, the pressure always starts at zero and changes very quickly, and your ear is very sensitive. I mean, psychoacoustically, attack is a very, very important part of the sound, and the details of that trajectory, that attack trajectory, are extremely important. One thing you don't want to do is do a strike as is done in MPE, or key on velocity as your whole attack velocity. That's not a good idea. So there's that, so the pressure sensitivity has two different things. One is how fast can you do it, and the other one is if things are slower and your ears can actually hear it, what about the accuracy then? So go ahead and play some examples if you could.
The first one is the soundboard.
Okay, Ed, I'm the suspicious sort, so if I were watching this, it's unclear what's coming from the pedal and what's coming from your fingers. So
The pedal's just a timbre change.
yeah, well, you say that. The next example will be more obvious. It's really coming from the fingers. He does like using pedals. Overall parameters are very useful, as anybody who's used a touche knows. Yes.
Is it just possible for me to stand there, because I really want to see actually
Oh, sure, yeah, go for it. Go for
If
it.
you don't play the continuum, you want to know.
Yeah. Anybody who would like to, this is informal, please come up. It's great to see the interest.
And the benches may be wider now.
Your wife might be watching, don't do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so but this next one then is a pressure-weighted portamento. So the idea there is that when you're making transitions between fingers, on a keyboard, you can set a portamento rate, or there's different ways to do it. But here, you really have control of the portamento trajectory. Because your ears are so sensitive to pitch, you need very accurate pressure if you're going to do a pressure-weighted portamento. So in this example, no matter what he does with his pedals, you'll be able to tell that it's accurate.
Actually, what Dorit mentions here, it's the only flaw I can think of in the continuum, is that performances don't look that interesting. Especially for me, because I'm always staring at it, but your finger movement is so subtle to get big changes.
I would recommend for performances like what Suzanne Jani is now doing, having a camera attached.
Right there, yeah.
So people really have the chance to see the details, which is so interesting.
And one thing I've been doing is actually standing and then tilting the instrument toward the audience.
Oh yeah.
Which
So then
makes
they
a
have
big
a chance,
difference.
yeah.
But you have to kind of practice that. And then you lean over even more, kind of like you're hovering.
But if it's really such detail, then a zoom
Right.
really just to the fingertips would really just add so much to understand what the continuum really.
Even that is hard, because like this, I noticed the other morning when the sun was coming up, if the sun is coming at an angle and you're standing off the end, you can really see the depressions in the surface and stuff. But then if you're playing with many fingers, of course, the first finger is the one you see and the other ones are hard to see. But there's some investigation we can do there. Okay.
Yeah, this second sound is pressure-weighted portamento, which means 2 fingers, and it's like you're on a giant seesaw. Is the
So that, in this case, he had several very long, very obvious in your face. Another very obvious in your face thing that people do with it is whammy bar effects and that sort of thing. But the pressure weighted per mental can also be used very subtly if you're playing a turn or a trill or something. It makes a big difference how the transitions between those notes happen. And it can sound much more like if you want to do a fall on the sax, you use a very different technique than if you want to, say, do a sequence of notes on a violin or so. All right. So one of the, is this all good to have the pressure sensitivity and such? This is a MIDI output from a rise and a Rolly rise. This is MIDI output from a continuum. Now the MIDI output on a continuum is already quite slowed for MIDI rates. But actually MIDI rates are almost enough for almost everything if you're very careful about how you use it. So the continuum uses 100% of the MIDI rate, and it's very careful about does it send 7-bit values if things are changing quickly, or does it send 14-bit values if things are changing slower, and but your ear can actually hear that accuracy, that sort of thing. In any case, even if you look at the MIDI output, which is not at the rate that the continuum is internally, but if you, this was Christophe actually provided these pictures to me. He had told me that the rise was so much more sensitive than previous instruments by the same company. They're really improving. But still, if you look at the output of it, this is a vibrato that was played very similar to this vibrato. And this is very regular, which actually, if you're not very good at vibrato, or if you have other problems, it can be helpful. It sort of frees you from having to, when I was I'm a violin player, and my teacher always told me I had a nanny goat vibrato, which turns out not to be a compliment. For me, this probably would have been better, but in general, if you want to get more detail of the finger shape and what you're doing, one of the continuum players was saying, yeah, it makes it so much more personal. So it's a little hard to say how to describe that, but if you play it, the thing that does happen is, especially in a sound like this last ones that build up, or the feedback guitar sounds, any of these things where you build up pressure or build up energy. Most commonly, it's in modal models where you have a bandpass filter that's building up energy. But however it's done in the sound, boy, you have to be careful. And just like with feedback guitar, if you fall off the edge, well, it's not pretty. It does take more skill and it's more challenging. Okay, so I wanted to say something about onset. So in the continuum, you get about 70 to 50 data points. It really depends a lot on what's happening. The continuum has algorithms it knows what is sent out over MIDI, and it knows what the current state is, and it tries to make the most send the most important items next. So it knows the difference between the two states. So it varies depending on what you're playing, but the attack matters a lot. In an instrument that this kind of attack detail, which again, this is MIDI output, you don't see everything there, but the attack shapes are different. This one is much more rounded than this one is. There's lots of details that if you were to listen to it, depending on what timbre you're playing, it's quite different. But if you want to be compatible with your MIDI library for MIDI keyboards, it's problematic because you get things like double attack problems. Your MIDI library has its own attack built in, right? MIDI, especially sample libraries, have beautiful fine structured sounds, but it's all automated. So if you play a note, you have the effect of your finger doing whatever your finger's doing, and then you have the effect of what's automated. And those two things very rarely coexist in any sort of nice way. If you want to be compatible with the MIDI world, you do as Rise does, where you have an attack. Unfortunately, it's not real accurate in the attack velocity value. You don't have long to measure it since it's a pressure difference. So, but it has a handful of different values that it can give you for the MIDI attack velocity, or the strike as they call it. And then over time later, it gives you variation after that. All right.
Can I just say
Yes.
two things about those graphs? So I think the time element is 1 second. Remember, Christoph, because I did a 1 second and
Yes.
10 second? And the other thing is that,
Wait, you did this? I thought Christoph.
well, Christoph did the data, but I did the max thing for it.
Oh, okay.
And then when it starts recording, this output starts recording when it gets its first MIDI value. So the fact that there's a slope here and an instantaneous rise doesn't reflect when the finger actually went down. It just says, when am I starting to report MIDI data? So maybe the finger was pressed here, and there's that time value where that was generated, as opposed to the continuum continuously generating a series of values within that.
Yeah, for the continuum, we did extensive tests of, he would do a surface microphone so you can hear when the finger hits the surface, and so we were very, very careful about latency. We didn't go that far here, and also the intention isn't even to say this is terrible, it's just this is actually useful, and people have done, I mean, listen to the best recordings with Rise, they're good. So that's not the issue, but the issue is these aren't the same. And it's very important when you spend a lot more money, are you getting anything? And well, yes, they're not the same. Let's see how I'm doing. Okay, so the next thing is a pitch sensitivity thing. And I don't, it's because people don't want to learn to place their fingers accurately and such, pitch sensitivity isn't such a big deal in synthesizers in general. But if you want to play in any key, I mean, almost half the continuums last year that I sold were sold to India, which is not a rich country, and import laws are, as I always tell Ed, even worse than Canada's. It's hard to get instruments there, and still it's a popular instrument there because you can play at any starting pitch. You know, it's really your finger placement, and people want to practice that. That's not a minus. That's something they're willing and wanting to practice. And now also we have several Turkish musicians who play makams. So there are other musics out there that really benefit from this. And in India in particular, there's a real worry that the traditional Carnatic music and such is being very much changed by synthesizers. So there's a funny thing about your fat, flabby finger, or even your thin, bony finger, when you think about how accurate can I place this, you know, on the keyboard, these things are ½ an inch wide, on a key set anyway. Actually, you can place your fingers to about 30 microns. And that number really surprises people. Because 30 microns, come on, give me a break. And yes, it's true, you can't, you know, go like this and hit within 30 microns. But what you do, and do all the time in acoustic instruments, is you make fine adjustments. And even in a flute or something, a great flute player will adjust the pitch of every note, and it's quite accurate. It's very difficult, but on a violin, me being a violin player, when you rock your finger, and you listen to beats melt away, that's about 30 microns. That's an estimate, and of course, in violin, it's complicated because your finger, it's not as simple as a continuum. Your fingers get closer together as you play higher on the string, and so these are all estimates. But I knew when I started the continuum back in the 1980s that if the thing isn't accurate to 30 microns, then you know that's the absolute necessary beginning point. So human fingers certainly do this, and lots of examples of it in a tight audio feedback loop. So one thing you can do is, if you have an expressive controller, can you sit down and play a just interval from the beginning, just, without starting equal tempered, and then can you, change the beats as any acoustic player would do. It's rare. Now, how much does that matter? I was saying last night to people, actually I'm a big proponent of not playing in equal temperament. On the other hand, I'm not that good a musician. There's a reason why I work with people like Ed and Christoph and Rob and everybody else here. I don't play that well. But I can tell, and I don't hear that well. I know what I don't know. But if I go to a good string orchestra concert afterwards, I feel different. It's a very different experience, and that's just because, hey, I just heard correct intervals rather than equal tempered intervals for a long time, and even somebody who's not a very good musician like me, it does have an effect, at least if you give them enough time. I wanted to mention something here. Hey, here's a continuum. This is a newer one. Don't do this with your continuum if you aren't sure. But yes, there's these inner pieces whose only job is to hold the rods from. Now the rods here are all floppy. That's because they, when you take it apart like this, the magnets repel each other. So yes, they're very uniform when it's actually all put together and squeezed together. It looks a little funny, but there's what it looks like on the inside. The question is, of course, well, you're talking about 30 microns. These rods here are much wider than 30 microns. So me, again, being the suspicious sort, I look at that and say, that looks like a quarter step. Okay, so how that works is, if you have the rods next to each other, remember these distances here are measured super accurately to about 14, 15 bits. Actually, somebody measured it the other day, said, it's really 17 bits, but I don't know. Anyway, very accurately. And how you measure that bit accuracy is actually complicated because magnets interact with each other and stuff. So it's in any case, you can get a parabola through, if you have your finger depressed here, yes, this is the lowest rod, but that's not your pitch. Your pitch is over 100 times better than that just by a 3-point parabola. So you get this perfect parabola, and you figure out exactly where the center of gravity is, right? You can see this one's depressed more than that one. So this is the nerd engineering thing. No player thinks about this. In fact, players are always surprised there's rods in there. You can't really feel it unless I tell you they're there. In any case, this one is a little bit to the left. This one, the neighbors are exactly the same, and this one, neighbors to the right. So you have this parabolic interpolation, which now I have many orders of magnitude improve, accuracy and pitch. Now, why is it so accurate? I mean, everybody's finger shaped different. Another trick, again, I've been at this for 35 years. I didn't think of this. I didn't study all the materials in the world and know, this is the one I want. It wasn't that kind of research. It was much more trial and error. But this neoprene is very, very uniform. And so, the way it distributes pressure from fingers, even if you have a bony finger or you're playing with a pen cap, you'll still get a very nice parabola by the time that it depresses the rods. Yes?
Have you done this, and if not, is there a way that this could be done to essentially not only derive that center point of the parabola, but also the radius? In other words, if it's a flatter type of pressure on it, or if it's sharper?
Yeah, I did that. You always get a parabola, but they are different shapes. They can be different widths. So my problem there is that then, I really wanted a pinky and a thumb to be able to do. Now, the thumb is problematic anyway because it's not in the right position. Most people don't play. Do you play with your thumb?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So some people play with their
Well, it
thumb.
depends what's mapped to why, because you sacrifice, the position of the thumb is so much lower.
Yeah.
So
But I could see, for example, the delta of that, a change in the parabola shape, being a mode of expression that you could use.
Yeah,
Very interesting in the controlling tone.
So what we've done, people, unfortunately, things go so many different directions. So what the width of the parabola, if you want to have that to super accuracy, is actually quite, when you get to the details, it's quite a different problem from where is the center of it. And so that's the one issue. The other issue that, like if you look at Indian musicians, almost all of them do a two-fingered play. which looks like a very fat finger, but they just find they can roll the fingers. In fact, like Christophe was telling me, oh, I do a 3-fingered play, and he was showing me, I grew up with clavichord in the home, and yeah, it's a clavichord vibrato. He just does a right-sided vibrato, so it only vibratos up and not down. So people now I also have the problem, of course, there's these, there's all these techniques that have been built on this. So it's a bit, yes, there's many other things I could measure. What's mostly happened is people are, in the recent years, we've really adopted the idea of the touche from the Martineau. We always had this thing where you could use multiple fingers to affect each other. But there's a big difference between that and really implementing a touche. And really using it more like a small area on the one. So there we get extra, additional parameters from the other hand. And since it's so hard to place your fingers, and if you're doing very fine timbre changes, it's just easier to have the other hand. Ed, you'll talk more about that later in the...
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of issues with the touche where, I was very proud in the Continuum, worked so hard to get everything under your finger. The pressure, as well as, all the XYZ is each finger individually. It lets you do this is not possible on very many instruments. Even a violin doesn't do this, right? You only have one hand. If you're playing with a touche, you can't do this because, again, you only have one hand. You need more fingers to cover an octave. So this Oscar Sala trick is very unique to this sort of setup, and I thought this was so important. Turns out the touche is really good for lots of things. So we have both modes
the
to play.
main advantage that it gives you is that if you play aggressively loud, you're digging into the surface, and to respond, you have to come up every single time. And if you have the touche controlling your volume, you can play lightly. And it makes it easier to play a fast run because you're not so far into the surface, and this is controlling your dynamics.
Yeah, one of the things is if you have a long crescendo from pianissimo to fortissimo, you really want each finger to have its own attack, but there's also just this overall problem that it's so hard to control that over a long time and just dig a little bit deeper. And Oscar Sala was amazing. On the Trautonium, he had to lift his finger between notes like up to an inch. So he had some tricks so he could avoid that, but that's not an easy instrument to play. But Ed has just found that, yeah. So the idea of the touche there is, for purists, yes, it's not a touche, but it's an area on the fingerboard used in a similar way as a left-hand control. It also has XYZ, usually just one finger. You could do anything you want, but normally just one finger. And in this case, he was getting some of the dynamics, the individual notes attacks, and its trajectory was still from the same finger that played the note, but there's some overall dynamic control also from the other hand. Yeah.
So you're talking about sort of left to right with this.
With a vibrato?
No.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm on the wrong side here. I'm sorry. I didn't
So
find.
my question is, what about front to back? In other words, a more flat fingered technique versus a more curved finger technique. Is there any kind of expressive gain to be had in that way?
So as a mechanical thing, the front to back is a ratio between pressures here and pressures here, and I do it. And it's useful, but you have to be careful how you use it, because anytime you take ratios between two pressures, it's not very accurate. So now it's monotonic. So accuracy, again, what does that mean? If you want absolute accuracy, where are you on the fingerboard? It will not give you that. But what does happen is if you, you can reliably either play here or here or here. I mean, it's a little bit of accuracy. But then if you move from there, and you're not pressing too hard, you're not bottoming out, then you can use it quite well. The counterpart on the violin, I would say, are things like you bow near the bridge or you bow near the fingerboard. Those are extremely important, especially in orchestral playing. But how many bits of accuracy is that really? I don't know, not much. But it's an essential part of violin playing. So as long as you're careful to use the Y in a good way, it's useful. Another thing that happened with the Y, we'll talk about that in the last talk today with what's new. It really is in my face again as well. Your fingers aren't shaped in a straight line. So if you make the Y really sensitive, or even if you play with a flat finger, they're all in different spots. So the absolute accuracy is not the only issue there. It's also, how do you approach playing the instrument? How do you curl your hands to keep them in a straight line? In any case, at this point now, the Y is very effectively used by Ed, and but it's not like the X dimension. You know, it's not. It doesn't have.
No, in fact, for the analysis of the data we're getting from the Y, we decided to favor a higher degree of relative accuracy than absolute, because we already had 2 dimensions where the absolute accuracy was there. So it's one of those dimensions where you can use it for effect, and you use your ear to respond to what's happening.
It's extremely useful. Like the best people playing overblow effects, say on a wind like and sound or something, is very effective there. And overblow is sort of that sort of thing too. You're doing it by listening. You know, you haven't memorized a certain way of doing it. You're responding to what your instrument is doing. So it would be certainly possible to get better Y, but the only designs I had for it would cost yet 10 times more than the Continuum, and as we all know, it's a higher end instrument already. So, with hindsight, I'm not sure it would have been worth it because of this whole problem of how your fingers are shaped and the reality of, well, if you try to measure too much, it's just too much.
I had a question.
Yes.
How many sensors are you using to detect one finger?
That depends how close the fingers are. In the new release, actually, we have that light
That's
action
not-
narrow,
yeah.
which is even less. Normally, it's 12. But if the fingers are too close, then, well, I'm still using 12, but it has to take into account how the fingers interact. So normally it's 12 sensors. But there's the raw data, a lot of stuff gets extracted out of that, namely your pitch, your pressure, and your front-back position. All right.
Okay.
So there's a lot of other things about pitch. Like most people that get the Continuum want to start playing right away, so they use pitch rounding, which is okay. As Ed says, yeah, use it on stage because, you know, but it's really good to practice with it off or with one of the lesser, Christoph and others have developed.
Well, that's
ones
what,
with
actually,
lesser.
to be fair, that's what Rob says, and I agree with him, that he practices without rounding, but because stage is more pressure, he'll turn on that rounding a bit.
Yeah, the trouble with the Continuum's rounding is it works great, and you'll be good at it right away, and you've cut off that part of your life. Because what happens is you're not learning the finger. You have a lot that you're going to have to unlearn later. The more you practice with rounding on, the more there is to unlearn. Because initially putting your finger in the right position, it's different on a violin. On a violin, you have dots on the string. As you're a beginner, you try to hit the dot, and then you listen to see if you did it. But you have to put your finger in the right position to get the right pitch. On the Continuum, it just corrects it. So you don't move your finger to the right position ever. It just fixes it for you. And then you can do vibrato from there. You can do all sorts of impressive things from there. Initially, when you're practicing, you learn all sorts of skills from that. And you can do great things. But in the end, this thing about having the beginning of every note be one of 12, I don't care what scale you load into your thing. It's just not, that's not very acoustic. It's not, I think you're losing a lot and you'll never learn the proper finger methods. But realistically, it is very hard. Now, how long does it take a violinist to learn to play in tune? I don't know. When I started playing, I'm sure for the first 3 years at least, probably longer. Maybe my mom wanted to hear me play, but nobody else. So.
I really like the rounding over time you developed with the Continuum. I find this very useful, so you can use both worlds actually at the same time. So.
Well, especially if you turn off the initial rounding. The most evil of all of these things is the initial rounding. It's like in a percussive instrument or something, it's really useful because, well, if you initially have it wrong, it's going to be wrong. So I'm not saying, this is a strict rule. Also, I'm not even a performer, so it's easy for me to talk. But that's a good point. If you do the rounding over time, especially if you back off on the rates over time, that's great. And again, on stage, you use more rounding.
We can cover that in performance techniques.
Yeah. Okay, so this is, let's see how we're doing on time here. We're doing good. This is the last part of this, and this is super important, especially being one of the greatest research places, or certainly in our part of the world. I don't want to insult anybody here, but in our part of the world, IRCAM is certainly considered the greatest electronic music research place in the world. So my something that I can contribute is that you can have all sorts of knowledge of all sorts of study and such, you can have incredible synthesis algorithms, and that's all good. And we have a style of modal synthesis, basically bandpass filter, overall system resonance kind of modal synthesis. We have delay-based synthesis, the waveguide synthesis. We have other kinds of synthesis, like this spectral, I don't know if you'd call it spectral modeling. I think somebody already has that term, so I have to be very careful what words I say. I don't know if anybody does exactly the same thing, but where you take a very small part of a sound and use it, and then manipulate the spectra of that, use it sort of as raw material. We have these different synthesis techniques, and that's great. And you know what? If you listen to these three or listen to others, they're all quite good, but what makes them really good, even if you just add FM to that list, which isn't, well, except in some very weird way, isn't modeling at all. The thing that makes it good is how are your finger actions mapped to parameters in the sound? And I think that's often forgotten in my part of the world in electrical computer engineering. It's people will study piano actions, and I've seen a lot of work on haptic responses of pianos and trying to simulate that, and I felt some things that were amazing. But that's still very different than just this fundamental thing, making a synthesizer system. And how do you put that person in this tight timbre feedback loop? And the Egan matrix has many constraints on how it was designed. I have a single shark processor. I stay on chip. It's a $17 chip. It's something that I can afford to put in things. Initially I had bought it just to scan sensors, but then later found out, hey, wait, this thing is, especially if you really optimize, if you don't just program in C, but you really optimize your loops and use the single instruction multiple data and the multiple memories, the multiple buses, and all the incredible parallel I/O support. It's incredible what you can do. So the trick there, though, is if you're doing optimized code, you do 128 bits transfer per instructions, per nanosecond and a half in this case, on chip. As soon as you go off chip, you have very expensive memory and you're getting 16 bits. That ratio is terrible. So we only do algorithms that stay on chip. So it's a funny thing in that way. It has to be shallow in some sense in that way, but it's gotten us a long way. It started off as a really as a prototyping playground for Ed, and eventually said, hey, let other people play in the playground, why not? So that's really what it is. But a huge part of it, as you'll see in the next talk, are you going to pick apart a sound in the next talk, or what are you doing?
No, I'm just doing a general introduction.
Okay, so I don't need to say too much about this, except it's a core part of the continuum. It's extremely important that this is in there, and it doesn't matter how nice and how fast a sensor you have and whatever else you have, if you don't map the finger actions in interesting but also controllable enough ways to sound parameters, all the rest of it is for naught. And so in that way, Ed will say more about it, but I'm extremely fortunate that in 1999 he bought the first commercially sold continuum, I think. Is that correct?
I thought it was the second.
Oh, maybe
that was that fellow that passed away. Was it David
oh, yeah.
Vessel? Or?
No.
No, it was before Richard, but there was a fellow that was at Berkeley, wasn't it?
No.
No, that's
was
another
later. That was later.
Oh.
Anyway, whatever it is.
When I bought it, you didn't tell me it was the first. I'll put it that way.
No, I didn't. And it rattled a lot. And it was, he took the attitude, oh, what can I make this do? Rather than, what are its shortcomings? No, it's just, but I had been working on it by then already for decades. I just knew I needed help, and he was. After a couple of years, we got together and did a lot of work. First in Kima, which is very good for this because you can dial down the latency. You can do a lot of things with it, and it's quite general purpose. It's a funny language because it's quirky in some ways, but it also has unique capabilities. I mean, there's a lot of things that I can hear right away. Oh, that's Kima, and why? I don't know. They're all the same algorithms as elsewhere, but just how you control things is different. And then after 10 years or so, we worked on the Egan matrix. In any case, in these formulas here, in many places in a matrix, the matrix isn't that complicated. You're not connecting that many things here. But I think when he picks apart a sound, that's definitely a talk to hear. it's surprising how much you can build up with a very, on the surface, shallow structure. In this sense, it's much like an analog synthesizer. There isn't a general purpose programming language and many, many levels and layering and stuff. It's fairly shallow adjustment of parameters and transfer functions for lots of different points in a matrix. All right.
Yeah.
I think that's it for the first talk. Any other questions? How are we on time? Did I talk too long? Look at that, 1 minute. Oh.
You have 15 more minutes.
Should we take a break? I'm used to teaching students who are scared because there's going to be an exam. So since you aren't students, maybe we should take a break and not just try to go
Could we
on.
hear those sound demonstrations?
Oh, I didn't do those. Oh, yes. Okay, so there's three kinds of synthesis here. The first one is modal, which is bandpass filter based. There's many different bandpass filter based kind of synthesis, but for you engineers, it's filters. I want to say very quickly, how do students come up with parameters for this? This is, in this implementation, it's an overall resonances of a system. So I actually learned this not from the music world. I learned this originally from architecture, which is they care if a building falls down. They don't model the building in great detail, but they do want to know what are its resonances and if there's an earthquake and such. So this is an overall thing. You have these modal filters. You have usually most of these sounds of 8 or 48 of them. And the way the students, if they want to just do a simple thing, they look at some time-varying Fourier analysis of a sound and just look at decay rates of the harmonics. It lets them get a guess of what are the bandpass filter bandwidths. You can look at the amplitudes. It's a little tricky with bandpass filters because they can build up energy, so they can be louder than you actually set them at and all these things. But just by looking at the frequencies, if you strike a piece of metal or whatever it is, you can see the frequencies, decay rates, and that sort of thing, and estimate parameters pretty well, and after that it's all knob twisting. Then you mess with it, and I encourage students, as I encourage anybody, don't try to replace, all the percussion instruments. We have things where we call by different names, like reed. Well, that's pretty generic. Yeah, it sounds sort of like a reed sound. If you really want to have a violin or get something with a bow and strings and a fingerboard, you're not going to interact with any synthesizer and have the same experience. And if you're trying to replace for violinists, that's great, but maybe that's not what we're so interested in. So all of these things aren't meant to be detailed models. They're borrowing something from these different sounds that we have.
Yeah, these are all 3 different paths to kind of the same destination.
I have to say, being a nerd, I have to say something about that. That was we had these wind, we had models that actually was surprising, like the struck bar and this wind sounds and stuff. They're almost the same. Like there's little changes and get totally different timbre, which makes sense in a physical sense. But in this case, it said, okay, well, what happens if you just make the even harmonics go sharp and the odd harmonics go flat, which is not really physical anymore. It sounds like that. So that's kind of a pretty sound, and
It's not
in
part
the
of the real
Midwest,
world, but it sounds organic.
Yeah. In the Midwest, we call that sort of thing ethnic because you don't know what it is. So that's a reed-like
Yeah,
sound?
that was a single reed, double reed with the spectral sets.
So again, that's a very simple model, and there's not any simulation of how the keypads work or something on that. Nothing on that level. But still, there's together with a good performer, there's a real sort of acoustic or personal-like feeling for it.
Yeah, well,
So
if you
there
don't
you're-
do the whole right.
Yeah, so there you're hearing a pressure-weighted portamento again. I mean, it's a monophonic thing, and it seems natural for a tin whistle. And the tin whistle again is delay-based or waveguide, Carpel-Strong style synthesis.
That's it.
And that last one was done by, I think all of these other ones were done by Ed. The last one was done by Christoph. All right. Any other questions?
No
Shall we
question.
stretch for a bit? You're not students, so many of you will come back after a break.
Okay, so thank you very much, Lippold. So I think you would